Hey everyone, Steven here, and today I'm reviewing the 27M2U-D from Innocn. This is a bit of a different monitor from what I normally review, as it's more for content creators that do some light gaming and content consumption versus just gaming and content consumption. So here my format will be a little bit different from my previous reviews. I'm going to start by covering the specs and panel menu first, but after that I'll be covering the things I like, potentially don't like, and gray area things all together, as I have to gear this review more towards the use case. With that being said, let's get into the specs. The 27M2U-D is a 27-inch 4K IPS panel mini LED monitor with 1152 local dimming zones with a 60Hz refresh rate at a 12 millisecond gray-to-gray response time. The typical brightness here is 450 nits and the peak brightness is 1000 nits. This covers 99% of the sRGB and DCI-P3 color gamuts with a delta E of less than 2. For ports, this has one DP 1.4, two HDMI 2.1, one USB Type-C with 65 watts of power delivery that you can use as a display input, and this has a headphone jack. The monitor has two 5-watt speakers that I'll do a sound test for in a little bit, and for physical adjustments, this can raise and lower 100 millimeters. This can swivel to the left and right 15 degrees. This can tilt 5 degrees forwards and 15 degrees backwards, and this can rotate 90 degrees to the left or the right. This is also VESA compatible with a 100 millimeter by 100 millimeter pattern if you wanted to mount this. Inside of the box, you will get the monitor, stand, base, power brick with cable, HDMI cable, user manual, and 2 color calibration reports, which I always like to see with monitors. Last here we have the price, which is normally $299, but this is currently discounted to $249 as of the making of this video. Next, let's go ahead and do the test for the speakers before getting into some of the panel settings. I have the camera roughly 3 to 4 feet away from the monitor. There are some subtle adjustments that I do in post just to make sure that this sounds as close to it sounds in person in the video here. Shifting over to the panel menu, the menu buttons themselves are on the bottom right hand side, and this is a multiple button setup, so it takes a bit of time to get used to. I wish here they would have gone with a single button just for ease of use. For the tabs though, you have professional, picture settings, game settings, picture-in-picture / picture-by-picture, OSD settings, and other settings. Looking at the professional tab though, let's go ahead and start with the 4 color gamut modes that you have, which include standard, sRGB, Adobe, and DCI-P3. After this, you have the gamma settings, color temperature settings, which I'm going to come back to. Then you have sharpness, shadow balance, low blue light, hue, saturation, and dynamic brightness. Going back to the color temperature though, you have natural, design, warm, which actually looks a little bit cooler than design. Then you have cool. And then you have 3 user modes, which allows you to control the RGB colors. Next, you have the picture setting tab, which has brightness, contrast, dynamic contrast ratio, contextual model, HDR, and aspect ratio. Let's look at the contextual model, which has various picture setting modes that you can enable. One thing I do want to note though is that if you change any of these different modes, whether that's in the professional tab, picture settings, or game settings, it disables the other modes. So you can only have one of these enabled at a time. For these contextual models though, you have movie mode, reading mode, night mode, and care eyes mode. After that, you have 3 HDR modes that you can change this to, which are standard, movie, and design. After that, you have the game settings tab. Here you have these 3 different picture presets that are again going to disable the other picture presets that you may want to enable that are in the other 2 tabs. But starting at the top, we have RTS/RPG mode, FPS arena mode, and MOBA arena mode. If you enable any of these, one of the things you may notice is that you will lose local dimming and backlight contrast with these modes enabled. For the response time, you have off, normal, fast, and ultra fast. This is just a slower panel. There is a difference between these modes. I'm not going to test them with my on-screen response time testing tool just because here it's not the main draw. This isn't, again, an ultra fast panel here, so you're not dealing with 120 to 240 hertz at 1 millisecond gray to gray or sub that if you were dealing with an OLED. Here, there is an impact when you adjust the response time, but overall the ghosting here is very noticeable considering the slower response time and the lower refresh rate, so just keep that in mind. After that, in the picture-in-picture/picture-by-picture tab, I won't actually showcase this in real time, but you can enable this, you can change it with the various settings here. So what is the signal source? What is the audio source? What is the position? What is the size? And then if you wanted to swap the window, which these are pretty standard settings that you will find on any monitor that offers a picture-in-picture/picture-by-picture mode. After that, you have the OSD settings here. This is just going to be position, how long it's on screen, if you wanted to actually shift it over to a different part of the monitor, and then you have some hotkey settings that you can adjust here as well. Last, you have the other settings tab. You have input signal at the top. Just leave that on auto. It's the easiest way to do that. But if you are struggling to get this to recognize something, you can tell it what input it should be on. Volume is set to 50% by default. Keep that in mind. And then the only other setting in here that I want to talk about is the light sensor. That is the sensor on the top of the panel itself, the molding, where if you turn this on, it will automatically dim based off the light in the room that you're in, so that you're not going to have an overly bright monitor. And I think one of the easiest ways to think about this is it's very similar to what your phone does. If you have this feature turned on your phone, if you go outdoors, so you've been indoors and it didn't need the high nits, it actually kind of dims the phone. But if you go outside and all of a sudden you're in full sunlight, it actually just cranks those nits all the way up so you can still see what's on your screen. This is essentially doing the same thing, but with your monitor. Now that's really hard for me to capture with my camera because my aperture just automatically adjusts to the level of brightness it wants to sustain, so you don't really get the good view of this on a camera. What I do want to showcase though is the local dimming zones in action. So as I'm taking the cursor from the very bright side of the screen over to the darker side, you do see that this actually dims way down. And for me, this is one of the ways that I can check in a very general sense, does this have the full 1152 local dimming zones? If it had like 16 local dimming zones or just a couple hundred, you actually end up seeing the adjustment. So you see zones that actually pop up on the screen as you're transitioning from white to black. This isn't doing that. You see that very tight, fine area around the cursor there, so you know it has the higher amount of dimming zones. Shifting over now to the results from the SpiderX color calibration tool. Here I'm checking the color gamut to see if what they're advertising matches up to my test results. So here we have standard Adobe RGB, the sRGB, and the DCI-P3 modes. I tested all of these. Standard is the best. Here you actually have 100% coverage of the sRGB. They're saying they only have 99%. They're actually over delivering for this. And then you have 100% coverage of the Adobe RGB. They don't advertise that, so just some numbers there. 97% of the DCI-P3, they're advertising 99%, so we're off by 2%, and then this covers 98% of the NTSC. What I will say about this is the best coverage. These are the highest numbers that I've seen out of any monitor that I've reviewed, period. They delivered a very top-notch monitor when it comes to the color gamut coverage here, but that's specific to the standard mode. Looking at the Adobe RGB mode, this covers 97% of the sRGB, 96% of the Adobe RGB, 85% of the DCI-P3, and 91% of the NTSC. It's interesting when I get monitors and they have like an Adobe RGB mode, sRGB, things like this, and then the percentage there with my test results, it actually is worse than their standard or wide gamut modes, and that's going to be the case with the rest of these results here. So in the Adobe RGB, it actually doesn't cover as much of that gamut as the standard mode, so keep that in mind. For sRGB, this covers 96% of the sRGB, again less than the standard mode, 71% of the Adobe RGB, which is going to be one of the worst results for that mode, 71% of the DCI-P3, this is going to be the worst for this mode, and then 66% of the NTSC, so it's just the worst results across the board for their sRGB mode. And then we have DCI-P3, this covers 100% of the sRGB, so we have that higher mode there, 88% of the Adobe RGB, 95% of the DCI-P3, which with this result, it actually puts it behind the standard mode, but again, standard mode is still the best across the board for the results, and then this covers 86% of the NTSC. With this standard mode, I think that's just one of the main draws of the monitor here. This, again, is just the best results that I've had across all of the monitors that I've reviewed and I've run this particular test. So now that I've covered the specs, the panel menu, the test results, I'm going to shift into just my overall opinion of this from the use case that I think this is more geared towards, which initially I was like, hey, this is really for content creators, content consumption, some light gaming. As I've used this more, I think as long as you're not playing anything where you really need that 120 plus hertz refresh rate, like a first person shooter or any game like that, I think this is pretty well suited for anybody outside of those needs. And so just from a review perspective, I've been racking my brain with how do I approach this? How do I look at this? Because it covers a lot of different bases outside of I need a high refresh rate monitor. But let's say you did need that. Let's say you needed something that was 120 hertz plus. They actually have a different model that is 160 hertz, and that is the 27M2U-D. So you get most of these same features and specs, but also that higher refresh rate. So that is a potential option to think about. But for everybody else, I think if you're not going to be playing a lot of first-person shooters, you don't need something that is insanely fast in terms of the response time, not just the high refresh rate. This is going to cover a lot of use cases here. So not just content creation, content consumption, but if you're playing more adventure-based games, RPGs like I mentioned earlier, and some third-person shooters. So I've played Helldivers 2, and 4K 60 hertz to me performs just fine. The massive increase in benefit I don't really feel if I'm playing this at 90 to 120 hertz at 4K. 60 honestly feels pretty close here. It's the same that you would get if you were playing this on a console with 4K 60 hertz. If you had the bandwidth for it, yes, you could bump up to 120 hertz on a console. Honestly, I never notice a massive increase in performance on consoles going from 60 to 120 hertz, especially if it even has the variable refresh rate. I just don't notice a big difference between the two. It's there, it's extremely subtle from what my eye can tell. Compared to a PC, if I go from 60 to 120, I do notice a bigger jump in performance, but that all is going to be game dependent also. So if I was playing Helldivers 2 on the PlayStation 5, let's say I could hit the 120 Hertz. I don't know that visually I'd notice a big difference between that and using this at 60 Hertz, which I've made sure to label any of the games here so you can see, is this in SDR, what the game actually is. So hopefully showing a large variety of gaming situations so you can see what the difference may be. The big one where you're going to see just it's not geared towards that is the first person shooters or any game that just requires a faster response time and higher refresh rate. But that's just gaming. If we're looking at these other use cases as well, yes, content creation, content consumption, everything looks really, really good. But if I wanted to hook up various things to this, we have that ability as well. So using it as a secondary monitor, if I was using this with a laptop, if I wanted to take my handheld connected to this, and it's using that USB-C input, not only for video delivery, but with that power as well. It's supplying 65 watts. You can actually charge up your laptop and various handhelds while displaying to the monitor. Other monitors I've reviewed in this same price range, kind of somewhat similar features, don't usually offer that. So kudos to them for actually including a USB-C here that has that type of power delivery. But you now have more use cases with those items as well, along with being able to connect this to your phone as long as it has a USB Type-C input. And then now you can display your phone to this monitor as well. This may come in handy if you're using the picture-in-picture by picture modes. So they are covering so many different use cases here that I've not quite seen with some of the other monitors I've reviewed recently to this extent. But a lot of those, if we go extremely high tier, yes, you're going to find similar use cases. Those also have different features that this doesn't have, but considering the price here, I am surprised at how much they have been able to pack in here in terms of use case variability and variety. There's just so many different things you could use this for. Initially, I was just like, hey, content creation, content consumption, very light gaming. But now that I've used it for a while, there's more to this than that. You're looking at the collection of all the features here that really make this, I would say, a great general use monitor across the board. Anybody that leans heavy towards, I need a high refresh rate, obviously this isn't for you. Anybody else, this is going to be a great monitor that you can utilize for the really good picture quality. The local dimming zones here just make the panel pop. It looks closer to an OLED because it's not illuminating those darker areas. So again, it kind of mimics the OLED visuals, not to the same extent obviously, but it kind of mimics those without the potential for burn-in that those have, so you don't have to worry about that. You have all the different adjustments that you can make inside of the panel menu. You have all the physical adjustments that the monitor can do, because they're giving you everything here with the height, swivel, tilt, and pivot, which you don't always see in this price range. I'd say the one thing they don't have here feature-wise would be like a KVM switch or extra USB ports, but they are giving you speakers, which do get really, really loud. So I find in this price range, there's usually some type of trade-off. You're usually getting one or two of those features, not all of those things. Which one of those things typically may be like RGB lighting. This has like the light strips on it, but they're not there. So I'm assuming this molding is used for various other models that do offer those features where this one does not. Odd choice on that. It's already there. Probably should have just included it, but I don't think that's going to be a deal breaker. It's cool if it has it, but if it doesn't, it's not something that you usually even see because it's on the back of the monitor anyways. So all of that to say, if you know what your use case is and you're not going to be playing any game that needs just a really high refresh rate, this is a really good option to consider because of all the features that they've packed into this thing. And the visuals here just look top notch. They look really, really good. Expect some tinkering when it comes to all this stuff. Like SDR didn't take as many. HDR took a little bit more on that end, By default, it didn't look really good, but once I adjusted it, I got it right where I wanted it to, and it's looked great since. Paired with those local dimming zones, again, this can look really close to an OLED without actually being an OLED. And then if we're looking at the overall saturation, which I really like a more saturated monitor, but this was even too saturated for me, I actually had to turn that down in the NVIDIA control panel from 50% down to 40%. Otherwise it was too much. It actually led to like color bleed that I could see on icons and things like that. It was creating almost like a blooming effect here, but once I turned that down, it's looked great since. A couple last minute things I know people typically ask about, which is how does text clarity look? Here it looks really good. We have that 4K resolution at the 27 inches. So this has just great overall text quality that I've seen across the board. Not anything where I needed to run clear type, but if you had any issues, you could do that. I don't notice any massive like text fringing or anything like that here though. And although this is an IPS panel, it won't suffer from IPS panel glow because you have the local dimmings with the many LEDs. So usually you may find if there's a very dark image on the screen, you would get that backlight glow to it. Here you're not going to see that because the many LEDs just turn off, eliminating any IPS panel glow you may have if it wasn't here. So I've been talking primarily about the things I like about this monitor. Are there any negative things that I've seen here, things I don't like? Nothing stand out, which is really good. I'm taking into account the price with this and the intended use case. If you were like, well, I'm gonna play first person shooters on it, they'd be like, this isn't the monitor for you, then yeah, you're gonna hate this thing. Outside of that, right, you don't need something that's really fast. I think most people are really going to like this monitor. I don't have anything that was just glaring as I was doing this review where it's like, hey, that's something that is just not really good with this panel. Everything here seemed great, especially when we're looking at performance. Preference-based things, you can go into some gray area things, like I don't like the menu layout. It just is more confusing to use. A single button there just makes it so much easier. The way they have the panel menu, I love the fact that it has all the options that it does, but it's just scattered everywhere, where if they were to reorganize this, you could actually make it easier to navigate and much quicker to use than its current state. And for some people, the amount of adjustments that you can make in this may be overwhelming. I think if you get it and right out of the box, if it's not to your liking, and you have to navigate not only the panel menu, but make some minor adjustments in the NVIDIA control panel or AMD control panel, that may lead to some frustration. You may be like, hey, this thing just doesn't look good, I don't like it. But if you adjust these things, you can really get this to look incredibly vibrant without being oversaturated. Like I said, I turned my saturation down in the NVIDIA control panel from 50% down to 40. I increased the brightness a little bit here and a little bit on the contrast. So there, brightness, you can go somewhere between 60 and 70%, and then contrast was about 60%. So I just adjusted these variables a little bit, left everything alone for the most part inside of the panel menu. The only thing I did increase there was the brightness. It was a little bit too dim for my liking initially. Once I did that, I mean, it's just looked so good. And that's what I like to point out to people. When you get a monitor, every monitor for the most part that I've used ends up needing just a little bit of tweaking. Every now and then I get some where it's like, man, I just use whatever picture preset, good to go. That's awesome. That's not the norm. Even on the extremely high dollar monitors that I get, with those, I end up having to adjust something in the panel menu or something in the NVIDIA control panel to get it to my liking, the visuals that I like. So keep that in mind if you do get this. Expect some time being spent just to adjust this just a little bit so you can get it exactly where you want it. Now, one thing I would caution with adjusting everything here, this has the best results for the Spider X color calibration tool in regards to the color gamuts, which I'm still blown away by because this is besting monitors that cost 4, 5, 6 times this amount. But with that, as I'm adjusting any of the settings in the panel menu or NVIDIA or AMD control panel, you'll have to think about these adjustments being very small and don't go to large adjustments because it has these very large color gamuts. If you're used to adjusting another monitor that you have and you're like, man, I really have to turn this all the way up or adjust this all the way down here, start small before you just jump to a large adjustment. Because what you may find is you're like, I was doing this as I was doing some of my testing. It's like, hey, I'm going to adjust this variable. I'm used to doing it like this. And then all of a sudden I've thrown off the hue or I've thrown off the saturation so much. You're like, oh man, this looks really bad. Start small because you have so much to play with here in regards to those adjustments. So that's going to wrap this video up. I think Innocn has a really solid monitor on their hands here for the intended use case. I was really blown away by the visuals here, and I was really blown away by, again, how great consoles performed with this. You're locked into the 60 Hertz. As long as you're okay with that, visually this thing is amazing. So playing the games that I played, they just looked great. And they were top notch compared to some of the OLEDs that I have reviewed. It looked closer to that than some of the other monitors that I've tested here recently. So they've done great on the visual side. They've done great on the amount of variety that you have with intended use cases here, with being able to plug in your laptop, your handheld, your phone. You get charging from that. You get to use this with consoles. You get to use this for content creation. If you're doing content consumption, it looks really, really good. There's just so much upside when it comes to this, all at a price that I think is really, really affordable. I'm really surprised they were able to bring it in at this price, considering this does have the many LEDs with it. If you guys end up having any questions about this, let me know in the comment section. I will make sure to answer that for you there. I will have links for this monitor along with the other version that I talked about that actually has the higher refresh rate if you want to check that one out. If you guys like the video, hit the like button for me as it helps the channel out. If you want to continue to follow along with all my content, hit the subscribe button for me. And as always, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.